1961, it was designated as a National Historical Landmark. And in 1962, the California State Legislature authorized the creation of Bodie State Historic Park. This led to the 170 remaining buildings being maintained in a state of arrested decay, meaning that while not having been restored, but having instead been protected from decomposing further. And although this means that no one can live in Bodie any longer, in a sense it's now far more popular than it was during its boom years. That's because to this day it receives about 200,000 visitors annually. It's easily one of the most popular ghost towns in the world. Number 1. Fordlandia, Brazil. While the Ford Motors Company may have made massive strides in improving the lives of workers across America, in Brazil, the company was less than successful. You see, Henry Ford first began to look to Brazil when he wanted to source his own rubber for his tires, as he was growing tired of having to pay for it from the British firms that had a monopoly over the resource. This caused him to invest about $20 million, or about $290 million today, into creating the equivalent of an American working-class town on the Tabajos River, which runs right through the famed Amazon jungle. Founded in 1928 and called Fordlandia, he created amenities such as American-style bungalows, swimming pools, hotels, and even a golf course in the hope that his Brazilian workers would grow accustomed to this type of community. However, to Ford's misfortune, the project became a disaster almost immediately. The first major issue was that there were no roads connecting Fordlandia to the rest of Brazil. Therefore, the only way to enter the town was by the Tabajos River, which proved to be a logistical nightmare. Then the American planters who had little knowledge of tropical rubber cultivation made the mistake of growing all the rubber trees close together rather than space them apart, which caused them to quickly succumb to tree funguses, disease, and various crop-eating critters. Yet worst of all, the Americans managed to infuriate their Brazilian workers by imposing strict sets of rules that include bans on alcohol, tobacco, and of all things, soccer. Causing the workers to revolt and the crop harvest to fail, Ford decided to move 40 kilometers downriver to a more fertile site. And while this site did end up producing some rubber, it was around this time that synthetic rubber became easy to mass produce. Making natural rubber to become obsolete, this caused Henry Ford's grandson, Henry Ford II, to sell all of his Brazilian land back to the Brazilian government for pennies on the dollar in 1945, losing millions in the process. As a result, the town now sits abandoned far in the depths of the Amazon. It still receives curious visitors from time to time. That's all we have for you today, everyone. Thank you all for watching.
Echo.
Everything you need to know about Akon City. Hello Explorers, welcome to another exciting video presented to you by the Explorer and thanks for watching. In this video, we will show you a magical city created and currently being constructed by one of Africa's favorite musician turned entrepreneur, Akon. Akon had a dream for a specific city and he is bringing it to life before our very own eyes. So in this video, we are bringing you everything you need to know about Akon City. Akon is the first artist to develop such an idea of having a futuristic city in his name. But before diving into Akon City, let's have a quick background on Akon. If you are new here, welcome. Be sure to subscribe and turn notifications so you don't miss anything.
Akon nunca foi uma city pioneer. Consider building one by one. Where to zero.
Wants to release the flood gates in your shower. His energy department is proposing easing a 28-year-old energy law so that shower fixtures with multiple nozzles would meet the federal guidelines for water flow of 2.5 gallons per minute. The president's spoken about this issue multiple times, saying he isn't getting wet enough and that he needs to keep his hair, quote, perfect. Critics call the proposal unnecessary and wasteful.
Are you upset about your weak and dribbling shower head?
Drip. Drip.
Well, thanks to President Drip easing restrictions on shower heads, Ted Badette's Shower Head Emporium is back in business. We have all types of irresponsible irrigation. Rest assured, these shower heads are so powerful, they're the type a talking ape would use to hose down a human if apes controlled the world. It could happen, so order a shower head from Ted Badette today, where our motto is always, don't point directly into face.
It's our Rick Show with Stephen.
When the world changed, it made us go back to the simple joys. And we love the little things.
Welcome back, folks. My guests tonight are two hosts of Showtime's political docuseries, The Circus. Please welcome back to the Late Show, Alex Wagner and Mark McKinnon. Hey, you two.
Hey, Stephen.
Nice to see you again.
Howdy. How are you?
I have three guests tonight. I have Alex, I have Mark, and I have his hat. I assume the hat has his own contract every season.
Absolutely.
All right, you guys, glad to see you guys are back. You've heard the show was off for a while because of the COVID. Now you're back out on the road. Are you staying safe?
Well, actually, Stephen, we ran through the primaries in March, which was our original plan, and we only stopped short a week because of COVID. But our plan was to come back to the conventions, and so now we're coming back. Of course, it's a completely different world than what we expected, and you know, like you, we're having to figure out how to do this differently in this completely different world.
Stephen, we're learning all about the reality of masking. That's
wow. I did not know about that. I guess I'm not wearing one. No.
You don't want to find out about it.
Well, please stay safe because circuses are not known for their cleanliness. Okay, let's talk about the big news. Kamala Harris announced yesterday, you both interviewed her, you covered her primary run. What tone does she set for Joe Biden now?
I mean, I think you saw a little bit of it yesterday. She is absolutely going to be calling on her litigating skills as a litigator, but she's also an incredibly, in the way that Biden connects with voters, Harris also has incredible interpersonal skills, and as a listener, you know, she's developed that part of her political muscle in a way that few others have. So I think she's going to be really valuable to him on that front, despite the fact that COVID is preventing a lot of the retail politics we usually see. More than anything, I think she freshens up the ticket. You know, the narrative around Biden is that he's trusted and he is a known quantity in American politics, and that's certainly shown to have some benefits. But I think everyone on that campaign is ready and welcoming someone with open arms who brings diversity to the ticket, not just in terms of race and gender, but experience and outlook. And I think it's coming at a critical time for the campaign.
There were really three imperatives. One, that it needed to be a woman. It really had to be a woman of color given the times and the issues that we're facing, but it also needed to be somebody who had experience on the national stage, who's used to the volley and the incoming that this ticket's going to get. I mean, the Trump Death Star is unloading already, and so you didn't want somebody who's new to the game because it's a human microwave out there, and she's been out there, she can handle it, she's used to it.
Okay, let's talk about the Trump supposed Death Star, because it really feels like he's having a little trouble finding a new game with this ticket, because the first thing he did was call her nasty. That's just retreading an attack against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Now he's pulling out like Hail Mary, you know, middle-aged man grievances like not enough pressure in my shower head. What do you make of his reaction so far?
I think he's had a hard time figuring it out, right? I mean, this is someone, the president gave $6,000 to Kamala Harris in his re-election efforts.
Right. Donated to her twice.
Exactly, and as did his daughter, so that's definitely a complicating factor. I think, you know, it feels like the president thinks that some of the same misogynist, sexist attacks, the sort of dog whistles around her being a nasty woman this morning, who called her a mad woman, which is doubling down on that age-old stereotype of the angry black woman. He feels like, it seems like that could work. I mean, I think the question is more about the American electorate. You know, what women, and specifically white women, tolerate this election season. Donald Trump won them by 47% in 2016. And the question is, are they going to depart from that rhetoric? Are they going to reject it in the 2020 election? And I think Kamala Harris is going to be the test case for where we are in terms of gender relations in this country.
Part of the problem, Stephen, is, you know, they're trying to paint her as a radical lefty. And part of the reason she was unsuccessful in the Democratic Party is because she wasn't. In fact, she has a lot of attributes that are good for a general election, like a tough former prosecutor, for the Republicans and independents. So that line of attack is not going to work very well.
No, when I was a kid, we would have called Joe Biden and Kamala Harris Rockefeller Republicans.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
There's the old cliche, well, do no harm, you know, as a vice president. What is the harm that is the danger here? Is it that she's not progressive enough? Because, you know, the younger people in the party rolled their eyes a little bit when she was picked.
I mean, one of the problems with Harris is that she had a hard time finding her footing in the primary because of the crosswinds between the progressive and the progressive end of the party and the center of the party. I mean, she ran as a progressive prosecutor, but then she had a hard time answering for her prosecutorial record on things like capital punishment, truancy, some of her tough on crime stuff in California. So she's going to have to figure out, you know, where she stands and what her ideology is, because it's certainly going to be called into question. And then I think there's just a sort of fundamental reality around what kind of woman she's going to be. Yesterday, in her remarks, you definitely saw the tenacity. She talked about Trump driving the country into the ground, leaving it in tatters. At the same time, she also burnished her credentials as mamala, someone who goes to swim meets, someone who's at home cooking on Sunday nights. These are the two sort of endpoints about where we ask American women to be. Can they be professionals and moms? Do they have to choose? I mean, she is going to be a test case, as I said before, about like our attitudes about women and what kind of, you know, what kind of image we want to see from the women who are leading this country.
The interesting part of the coverage of the announcement was that people declared it both bold and safe at the same time. So you have a woman of Jamaican Southeast Asian heritage who is being declared as somebody who's a safe choice. And that says a lot about her background. I mean, she's experienced, she's been in the Senate.
I think it says a lot about the Democratic Party. That is a safe choice for them.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And Alex, you make a great point about the Biden kind of connection to Obama.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we sense in Biden a real sense of almost gratitude in that Obama made him the vice president of America's first black president. And I think in a lot of ways he sees himself as the connective tissue between what could be two monumental historic leaders, which is to say the country's first black president and the country's first Asian American black vice president. And that's what's what about the Democratic Party too, that this 70-something-year-old white guy from Delaware could end up being a figure of just transformation for the country and building a more inclusive and equitable America.
Conventions start next week. We're going to be live. Are we still going to be live? Well, we hope to be live next week. There are some challenges. So we hope to be live. What's the point of a convention when there's no convening anymore? Can you still call it a convention?
You really can't. You really shouldn't, Stephen. I had a lot of responsibility for the 2000-2004 campaigns and conventions. In fact, even back then, almost 20 years ago, we had a lot of discussions about how completely anachronistic these things are. The balloon drop and the rolling party and the terrible speeches and horrible entertainment, especially on the Republican side. You know, there's really only a few things that you have to do, which is what we're going to find out next week. And I think from now on, they'll be forever changed.
Can I say one thing, though, Stephen? I had a conversation with Cecile Richards, the former head of Planned Parenthood, the daughter of the late, great Ann Richards of Texas. And she said, you know what I remember about Geraldine Ferraro? I was there with my mom. And the evening she accepted the vice presidential nomination as the first female nominee vice president for a major party, all the men on the floor gave their floor passes to women. And remember getting that pass and going with my mom and watching Geraldine Ferraro stride to the stage in her white suffragette pantsuit or blazer. That's an incredible memory. And
it's the reasons like that I hope the conventions don't go away. I think it's important to get together.
It is.
Very quaint.
We have to take a quick break, but stick around, everybody. We'll be right back with more Alice Wagner and Mark McKinnon from the circus.
The country will be moving to alert level 2 with bans on travel between provinces and the sale of alcohol and tobacco products being lifted. The easing from level 3 is effective from Monday midnight, and the move follows a special cabinet meeting on Saturday afternoon. Throughout the week, cabinet received advice from health experts. Now, these experts have advised government that the country has now managed to arrest the rapid transmission of the COVID-19 virus and that healthcare infrastructure would not be undermined.
Cabinet has decided to place the entire country on alert level 2 with effect from midnight on Monday, the 17th of August 2020. Alert level 2 in terms of our risk-adjusted strategy in dealing with the pandemic means that there is moderate COVID-19 spread of the virus with a relatively high health system readiness. The move to level 2 means that we can remove nearly all of the restrictions on the resumption of economic activity across most industries. Economic activity will be allowed with the necessary and appropriate stringent health protocols and safety precautions in place. Therefore, the following changes will take place with effect from under level 2. All restrictions on interprovincial travel will be lifted. Accommodation, hospitality venues and tours will be permitted according to approved protocols to ensure social distancing. Restaurants, bars and taverns will be permitted to operate according to approved protocols as to times of operation and numbers of people. Restrictions on the sale of tobacco will be lifted. The suspension of the sale of alcohol will be lifted subject to certain restrictions. Alcohol will be permitted for on-site consumption in licensed establishments only up to 10 p.m. Liquor outlets will be allowed to sell alcohol for off-site consumption from Monday to Thursday during the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. only.
For more analysis of the President's speech, we are also joined by economist Alex van der Heever via Skype. Alex, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good evening.
What are your thoughts with regards to the President's pronouncement that the country is moving from level 3 to level 2? Are you at all surprised?
I'm not surprised. I think there was quite a lot of talk about this, and government was under pressure to explain the remaining restrictions on economic activity, and it was struggling to do so. So those definitely needed to be done. So I think that this as a set of measures could have been done earlier, but I think it's certainly welcome that this has happened now, finally.
Well, no doubt the South African economy has been severely battered by this COVID-19 pandemic. So do you get a sense that South Africa is well capacitated to recover from this pandemic?
I think it's going to take some time to get back to normal. I think just opening things up allows sort of the natural workings of the economy to get back into action again. Where we are going to struggle is public finances. The loss rate from just from the tobacco and alcohol bans is probably around about close to 50% of the value of what we're going to borrow from the IMF. And this, to me, is a real concern. I think that our fiscal position is in serious distress, certainly when you look at it from a 3-year perspective, but it is also in a precarious position for the 2020-2021 financial year. And I think that a large part of that fiscal distress was unnecessary.
And the big figures that have been bandied about in terms of South Africa borrowing from the international financiers against a very limited and a severely battered fiscus as a result of people losing jobs, as a result of the loss of revenue through this ban on alcohol and tobacco products. Do you think we can, we could recover from this?
Well, I think that we can recover. I think we've made our position far more difficult than it needed to be. Because the spending that we have to do from government side to restore the performance of the economy is hugely constrained, because we're not really in a position to expand expenditure, given that the access to capital is now so restricted. So government's ability to borrow is in real difficulty at the moment, and that's really what you need. You want that flexibility and that space when you're trying to boost your economy out of a recession. But we really hit our economy in multiple ways, and it has had a feedback effect on government's finances. And as a consequence, government is actually not even in a position to deficit spend its way into additional growth. A strategy that you have to engage in very carefully when you do it, but now we don't even have that as a major option.
I mean, in this quest to economic recovery, what are some of the quick wins that the government should look for? What are some of the low-hanging fruits that the government should be picking in order to ensure a quick recovery?
But I think that all barriers to getting the economy functioning again need to be removed. But it's quite difficult to look at what additional measures are going to be undertaken. So, for instance, the idea of increasing infrastructure spending as a route to re-stimulating the economy is definitely something that should be considered, but it is quite difficult to do. Government has had real difficulties actually organising itself to expand infrastructure spending, but now it faces the additional constraint that it would have to, it's not going to be able to borrow very easily in order to spend that money. From an international borrowing perspective, I think the risks within the South African context are high. Government hasn't covered itself in glory with all the corruption around the PPE and the COVID spending. So there's some question about whether additional money even borrowed is going to go down a black hole, or whether it's actually going to be used to drive the economy.
Can the government really afford to borrow a little bit further for its quest to ensure that the livelihoods of South Africans are maintained? I mean, most South Africans have lost their jobs. Most South Africans have had to take huge pay cuts, and they need some sort of financial relief.
Yeah, so typically government would provide would become a catalyst to drive economic demand and get it going again. So I think we will see some boost coming from just reopening the hospitality industry under the under improved protocols to protect people from COVID, which people are now understand a lot better than they did in March. That will help, just naturally that will help. But I think that it's going to be difficult to raise a lot of additional funds for government. It will probably have to reorganize some of its own spending in order to be able to boost those areas of the economy where we can get most leverage. We really do need to look at that. But the problem with government at the moment is it's very slow to restructure its own activities. It's very quick to devastate the private sector, but it is very slow to drive any change, any structural change within its own area of domain.
And these negative economic shocks are so large, are so sufficiently large to push many households into positions of food insecurity, and this reduced capability to buy food has been brought about by the severe shock to household income rather than a shock to food availability, such as in a drought. So many South Africans are now on the brink of hunger as a result of the lack of means to provide food for their families. Am I not? Am I correct?
Yes, I think we're in a very difficult position, and that government in itself not only has had a poor response from to supporting households, in other words, being able to identify them and support them, because of the machinery of our social security system is so weak that it can't really identify people in need very well and efficiently. There's also been corruption in the distribution of, for instance, food parcels and those kinds of support measures. And then we've had very, very slow-moving efforts from the Unemployment Insurance Fund and as well as moving some of the additional loan funds that government has created in order to support business that have just not, they're just too slow to move. And that's to a large extent because we lack the systems in place to actually very efficiently support much of any part of our economy that is suddenly in need. But I think that we are going to have to deepen our support to people in desperate need. We have to do that, but we're going to have to do that by also restructuring what we do in government, because we can't just carry on the way we're doing and then try and sort of redistribute. We've actually run out of a lot of runway at the moment because of the shutting down the supply and demand side of the economy simultaneously. It is so damaging, and we're going to have to be incredibly careful as to how we move out. But we've got to support people and we've got to get businesses going.
And as the pandemic recedes, South Africa should definitely look to rebuild more fiscal resources so that it can respond to a future crisis. Which ones are these? I mean, with so much talk with regards, or rather criticism leveled towards the South African government about the issue of corruption and depleted resources, what are the sources of, for more new fiscal resources that the country should look into building?
So a large amount of money is tied up in very inefficient spending within government. Now, restructuring that in a very short period of time is quite difficult, but it does need to become a priority. But there is no sense that government actually understands how to do this at the moment. So this is a concern. But it's one thing that has to happen. We have very bloated administrations, so people who are very inefficient, who don't do a great deal. We've got very poor systems in place, and we've seen how in many cases, the health systems in many provinces have just failed to respond effectively during this period because they've got a history now of internalized and endemic corruption that has basically destroyed the integrity of their performance. So on the one hand, we've got the wrong people employed within the system, we've got the wrong organizational structures, we've got too many people earning too much, doing too little within government. And that needs to be, and that is effectively where some of the money is tied up. On the other hand, we have many health services and public services that are very labor intensive, and rightfully so. And and you can't just cut those services. But we would have to reorganize a lot of the administrations and the areas where money is just being wastefully spent. But we basically do have to find money within government to redirect those resources. I think that government will try very hard to find additional capital to borrow to support and inject energy back into the economy, it has to do that. And it has to become fairly creative about doing that, given that we've been downgraded so drastically in South Africa. That we have to lower the cost of borrowing, and we also have to be able to access borrowing. Those are the two constraints that we will have to overcome in the next 3 years. But I expect it's going to be a slow walk out, and a lot of what happens in South Africa is going to depend on the extent to which a lot of the other and larger economies in the world stimulate their way out of the COVID crisis. Because I don't think that South Africa is going to do too well on its own. It's going to depend very much on the rest of the world also driving economic growth.
What are your thoughts of the efficacy and the effectiveness of the lockdown? I mean, there's so much criticism has been leveled against the government with regards to some of the rules which are quite unnatural and which have solicited business and the trade union movement to come together and calling for a more liberal interpretation of some of the rules. So what are your thoughts on the lockdown?
I think that the lockdown was very, very poorly thought through. You always required a balance of risk approach in responding to the epidemic. South Africa is not the United Kingdom or the United States or New York. It's not a country that can luxuriously enter into lockdowns without consideration of the long-term and even medium-term consequences. It's got to basically take the economic aspects into account. We have seen a huge surge in excess debts in South Africa. Now, some people might regard those excess debts as being unrecorded COVID debts. That's certainly not my interpretation, and there would still have to be a lot of analysis of this. I estimate only an undercount on COVID-related specific debts of around about 3,000 to 4,000. That's an undercount. This would leave about 29,000 excess debts that could be regarded as collateral debts. In other words, those are debts caused indirectly by the epidemic and potentially by the lockdown itself. So the lockdown itself is incredibly damaging socially and economically. And we are going to be having to carefully count the cost of what this lockdown has actually done to this sort of viability of many societies and communities in South Africa. I think that it's had even a more severe effect than we fully understand at this point. And those deaths, potential collateral deaths, and the scale of them are one of the first proxy indicators of the damage. And I think that what we should have really considered early on was getting the health protocols in place for our economy to reopen safely. And those initiatives should have been in place by the end of April and the early part of May, but they weren't. Our testing and tracing strategy was not in place. We were meant to have a tracing app in place by the end of April. No tracing, and now that the president's only just announced a tracing app to be in place, well after we've experienced major surges in the epidemic. So those non-pharmaceutical interventions, critical to suppressing the epidemic while keeping the economy open, had to be our core strategy in the South African context. That's not going to be the core strategy in the United Kingdom or in France, but it has to be the one in South Africa, and we didn't do it. So we are now suffering huge consequences that potentially we could have avoided.
All right, Alex van der Heever, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your thoughts. But you're still watching the Globe on SABC News. I'm Sim Pure. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, South Africans, as of Tuesday, the 7th of August, can move freely across the all 9 provinces. President Cyril Ramaphosa says Cabinet has decided to move the country to level 2 of the lockdown. The ban on tobacco and